So now let's continue, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce a good friend of mine for many years, Dr. Fabrice Serodes. Let me say a few words about his background, and then we can introduce him. Dr. Fabrice Serodes teaches history and geography in Brussels, in European classes, and European studies and European politics as a whole. He holds his PhD from the University of Manchester, and he is the author of a number of books, primarily focused on history, the European parliaments, as well as cultural diplomacy. The lecture topic that he's chosen today is Opportunities for European Cultural Diplomacy, ? Is it a question of institutions? If you could please join me in welcoming Dr. Fabrice Serodes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
We can't keep it like this.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark, indeed, for this invitation. Well, I will speak here not as a specialist, but rather as a thinker on European relations, and I would like to think with you on some of these interesting topics. Having worked a lot of years, many years, on Anglo-French relations, I was very interested in the latest speak on the stand of France and Britain. But as we will see in my paper, I don't think they are so much opposed as our speaker said. Especially they are both fascinated, Cameron and Sarkozy alike, by the concept and notion of sovereignty. And I think that there is no difference on this, and we will discuss this a bit later, but sometimes some stereotypes have to be checked out twice. I would like to make a pledge for a European cultural diplomacy. So you've heard many things today. I don't want to make it long, but I would like to make some comments on it. So Jean Monnet's quote on starting the European Union all over again with culture may be a fake, as it is often said. Culture still remains an empty field in a global context now of economic crisis. Many citizens even question the need for a European cultural diplomacy. The member states already perform quite well on their own through notorious national institutions, ministries, embassies, or cultural agencies. So, do we really need one? In the United States, the revival of cultural diplomacy is a consequence of 9/11. The attacks were partly seen as a lack of mutual understanding and dialogue between civilizations since the end of the Cold War. Significantly, in Europe, the attacks on Madrid and London didn't have the same impact on the European Union and are considered as national tragedies rather than European issues. The need for a stronger union to cope with the risk of terrorism, for example, or territorial fragmentation, was not and is still not obvious. There are, however, many useful aspects of cultural diplomacy. It appears as part of the solution to various contemporary issues. At home, first, the recognition of complex and multicultural identities, like in London, in Berlin, in Paris, in Brussels. A lack of mutual understanding, leading to nationalist policies and the rise of populist parties in Western and Eastern Europe. Abroad, also, it has many advantages. No clear visibility of a common European brand at the moment abroad in a competitive environment, so it should make it clearer. How much money is wasted in cultural competition abroad at festivals and exhibitions. And finally, a weak cultural job market at the moment includes 2 to 3 million people. We could do better than that. So for all these reasons, it is in the interests of European states, UK included, and institutions to promote cultural diplomacy at a European level. So I would like to do these two parts. First, the financial, legal, and mental framework for cultural diplomacy. It has been a bit dealt with before, so I will go faster on this. And I would like to introduce a new cultural diplomacy since, let's say, 2008 and 2009 in Europe. So, about the financial, legal, and mental framework, we must underline the fact that it is limited. First, there are not enough funds for European cultures. The consequences of the current economic crisis are easy to see in the cultural field. Budget cuts, closing cultural agencies. And this is nothing new. Culture is still considered as a luxury, not an investment. As such, it is one of the first scapegoats of austerity policies. Look at the budget. European cultural diplomacy's budget is not growing. It is said it is growing, it's not. In 2005, the EU budget for culture represented 0.12% of the entire EU budget. The culture program 2007-2013 costs nowadays 40 million euros, the third of 2 years of French cultural diplomacy. For the multi-annual financial framework, the next one, 2014-2020, the Commission proposes to allocate 1.6 billion for the cultural sector, billion euros. It is still less than one euro per capita a year. That is 0.16 of the entire EU budget now, so we raised from 0.12 to 0.16. So per year, it makes something like an increase of 0.003% between 2005 and 2020. So let's say nothing. The cultural diplomacy rely now only on national budgets. And national budget, as you know, are all at the moment quite well restrained by austerity policies. So they set bad example and are in competition now abroad. Look at Britain. In 2007, the British Council announced a change in the nature of the services it provides in the field of culture in Europe. Funding of EU-based offices was reduced by £20 million. 10 offices are and were and are to be shut down in Austria and in the new member states. The French government is not very much different from this. It has to shut down 2 French institutes in Spain in 2005 and 2006. In Germany, more than half of the French cultural institutes were shut down. So Europe is not anymore a priority of national cultural diplomacies. Besides, the legal framework is quite narrow, as you know. So legitimation has been introduced here and was granted for the EU action on cultural since Maastricht, based on the Article 167. But the keywords of this text are, first, respect. We have to respect national and regional diversity. And second, since Lisbon, subsidiarity. So it is not really a proactive policy. It is more respect, so we shouldn't touch it, we shouldn't change it at all. And this mentality makes it difficult to change things at the moment. Finally, we should insist on people, European citizens. There is, of course, a lack of common European cultural identity. The global context is not very helping. Citizens react to globalization by underlining national, regional, and local traditions, which might turn to negative. So in 2008, 65% of Cypriots, 63% of Greeks, and more than half of citizens in France and Slovenia and the United Kingdom and Estonia consider globalization as a threat to their own culture. So, of course, in this context, it is difficult to improve another one, even at a European level. We should, of course, explain this by many factors. Geographical distance remains sometimes an obstacle in some regions and slow communication in Eastern Europe sometimes. Education is also part of the answer, as a minority of European citizens has real intercultural competencies. But the TV programs are more crucial, I guess, to understand this divide. And there is no common European program so far, if we pay close attention to this. And finally, people have and still have some prejudices, as we could notice here. There is an ignorance and lack of curiosity of contemporary and visual arts of neighbor countries. Seen from a Western viewpoint, it remains difficult to recognize some foreign cultures. And Rio Pleshu and Marag are not very familiar names in Western Europe, for example. The weight of American culture productions becomes the only common point. But despite this negative overview of things right now, we have to notice also a shift in cultural diplomacy at a European level. But first of all, before analyzing this shift, we've got to underline the real goal of cultural diplomacy. Because when we hear, especially British speakers on these issues, they say, well, it's all about global culture or making everything compulsory. It's not. The efforts to build a cultural diplomacy, what is it all about? They are reduced at the moment by the still seducing ideas that we have to look for a common goal when we should already define some basic values like democracy, universal human rights, and fundamental freedoms. I think we would agree with that. But cultural unification is impossible, of course it is. And that's not the goal of a European cultural diplomacy. The EU has taken the lead to promote cultural diversity in the frame of the UNESCO Convention of 2005. So it's another view, another perspective, a more limited goal that should be here underlined. So it's very different from global unification. But there must be a value added in both cultural and economic terms. A common cultural policy, for example, should help the weakest cultures to emerge, to be promoted. And this common policy would be part of the global European exports. These will be concrete advantages. This will be the goal also of cultural diplomacy. Besides, there is a tradition in Europe, one of the main obstacles nowadays to this cultural diplomacy. It is the fact that national governments are more and more focused on traditions and like very much unilateralism or bilateralism maximum. Cultural diplomacy remains mainly a national initiative. Governments try to capitalize a particular field of expertise during the national presidencies here in Brussels every 6 months. But it is national presidencies, like at the moment for Poland. The enlargement actually has strengthened this trend, but it is fragile. Since 1999, for example, Hungary and Romania have had a bilateral agreement whereby they promote each other's literature, books and films. In 1992, a Hungarian cultural center was opened in the capital of Romania, Bucharest, and a Romanian cultural center was opened in the capital of Hungary, Budapest. Because of the crisis and the change in policies, non-official and off-performances budgets are now cancelled and people are fired, whereas funds are transferred to help migrant minorities abroad. A concert organized by the Romanian embassy given in the National Theatre had to be cancelled under the pressure of far-right parties. So these national cultural diplomacies are very fragile, in fact. And they have really little to do with a real European cultural diplomacy. That's why it is needed at a European level. And in fact, we must confess that more and more initiatives have been taken since, let's say, 2007, 2008. At home first. There are not many things, but still we can notice some European and really European projects, the European cultural capitals, or, for example, the digital library Europeana as one of the main initiatives. Abroad, there is some progress too. To broaden Europe is about switching, in fact, thinking in terms of Europe in the world instead of differences between member states. The European Neighbourhood Policy, the Eastern Partnership, the Union for the Mediterranean and the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, which all have resources allocated to cultural programs, are now on. Culture is part of the ACP agreements. A protocol on culture has been added to the EU CARIFORM in 2008. Media Mundus, the European Commission's new international cooperation program for the audiovisual industry, subscribes to this ambition. And finally, in May 2011, as mentioned here, MEPs advocated setting up a cultural diplomacy directorate within the EU External Action Service. So, to conclude, a series of recommendations to promote European cultural diplomacy. Europe is not anymore the cultural center of the world, but has still a lot to offer. The main challenge it faces at the moment, it is to avoid to become a giant museum, or was another Disneyland, and to act really as a global player. In a recent report, the European Parliament has suggested some new ideas, and we can sum up some of them and add to this list at least 5 suggestions. A common cultural agenda should be adopted by the Presidency and the Council. Second, cultural exchange should be part of the European citizenship, like the voting right to European elections. So cultural exchange as really a right or a duty. There should be decisions taken on shared cultural offices abroad. So embassies, consulates, institutes should put that culture in common. This is not yet really the case in Africa, in Asia, and this should really be an example of it, where Europe is considered as united, seen from abroad. And maybe a final recommendation would be the people in charge for this. It is a good thing to have one single representative responsible for the culture, like common cultural ambassador. I don't know, not necessarily we should add another position, but it should be the duty of present EU officials abroad to be cultural ambassadors as well. But the main issue is to recruit specialists, maybe you, in the cultural field. And for that, we need to change the EPSO tests. Because, as you know, cultural issues were removed 2 or 3 years ago. And nowadays, you don't need anymore to be very qualified in European Union to get access to it. So, I think that culture shouldn't be led to managers or MBAs, but really be part of an education program within the European Union, because it is not something you can really learn like this. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fabrice. It's about time we had you back at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy for a lecture, and I thought it was great to have your perspectives on European cultural diplomacy. So please, I'm happy to take questions, comments, reactions to Fabrice Serodes and European cultural diplomacy. Who would like to go first? You can't leave them there in peace without asking a few questions. I see one in the back and one in the front. Please. Yeah, sure, please.
Hi, I just had a quick question about the fact that you were stating that so many of the British Council and the French institutes were closing, and I'd just like to take your opinion on the fact that China, for example, is opening these Confucius Institute at such a rapid pace all over the world.
Exactly, and that is exactly what is mentioned in some conferences in France right now. You've got debates on cultural diplomacy, but they are national ones, so it is on a national basis in France, and they really notice, they have all mentioned this fact that they are opening in China and abroad, of course, more and more Confucius offices at the same time when European, cultural centers are closing. This is, as a matter of fact, we can notice this. So it doesn't really strengthen European integration.
Okay, who'd like to go next?
For those interested, actually, I've noticed that there is a colloquium on cultural diplomacy organized by the French Foreign Ministry on Monday and Tuesday next in Paris. And precisely one of the speakers, Xavier Darcos, is responsible for the French institutes abroad, and has mentioned what you've just said about the Confucius institutes.
Maybe one question for you as a French as well as a European. We were talking this week about unilateral cultural diplomacy a lot, things such as Alliance Française, Goethe Institute. Also the possibility for more multilateral cultural diplomacy. Do you see that as a realistic option, let's say in the next 5 or 10 years, that instead of just a network like Unique, that we could actually really see more serious, substantial collaborations? Possibly even instead of having, let's say, Goethe Institutes and British councils, maybe some sort of a European house or European institution really working for Europe as a group, as opposed to each country doing their own thing.
Yes, actually, I've just listened to an interesting interview of a French artist called L'évêque. He was there during the French presidency of Europe in 2007 or 8 in Brussels. So it's a kind of official artist in a way, but he said that the Alliance Française, for example, in Senegal, and that's what I noticed 1 month ago when I was there, played this role of exporting also cultures of other European countries. So you've got some examples from time to time. And there was an attempt, I guess it was in 2003, 2004, in the context of the Iraq crisis, to put some of these institutions in common. But nowadays, there is nothing much more than that. So there are attempts. It seems to be working, but there is no political will, and wind behind this.
I suppose in France there's even less political will for this idea?
No, on the opposite. I guess there is a certain pride of national culture, so there is a trend to make it really the French way in a way, but in the other sense, abroad, as we've got, there is the first cultural network is the American one, and the second one is the French one. So they've got so many institutes abroad that sometimes they have to hire their buildings and express the cultures of other European states, member states. So it is happening right now. It is happening right now, but it is not the majority of cases.
Well, so on that note then, if we could please join in expressing our gratitude to Dr. Fabrice Serodes. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee.